What's poppin', folks at home? Welcome back to the channel. Today we're going to head underwater and talk about my favorite jigs and jig trailers for fishing in the fall, in the spring, in the winter. It's jig season, baby. It's time to lock in and figure out what they're biting and how we're going to fish it.
There it was, right on the edge. Good fish. Get in the boat. There we go. Excellent jig fish right there. So when we're talking about jigs, right, we're getting into a whole deep dive. There's some guys that have spent millions of years and thousands of hours throwing jigs that are going to have an opinion. There's other guys that throw jigs sporadically that are going to have an opinion. I'm going to talk about the jigs that I fish, the things that make me successful up here. Remember, we're talking northern natural lakes. Southern impoundments, whole different thing. Florida, whole different thing. Texas, whole different thing. If we're talking northern natural lakes, we're talking specific jig fishing for docks, pontoons, maybe some deep structure, maybe some football jigs. But really, we're talking about emulating two things when we're talking about jig fishing here in northern natural lakes. The number one thing we're emulating when we're throwing a jig up here is crawfish, right? So with that in mind, I like to sort my jigs and trailers into two separate categories and then two other categories inside of that. Number one, when I'm talking about crawfish jigs. If I'm throwing a crawfish jig, I'm throwing one of three colors. In the early spring, I have found that brown with orange in it works really, really well. Same thing with that brown with a burnt orange with some black in it. Both of those colors in the early spring are going to work really, really well. On the flip side, if the water is really dirty, the old black and blue is a good thing. Now, mixing up colors on jigs, I tend to find sometimes can be in your favor. Here's the staple. The number one jig that I'm going to throw if I'm trying to flip for a crawfish profile in black and blue up in the shallow when the water's in the 50s and the fish are moving into bed, I'm going to throw that Ike's mini flip jig right here in black and blue with a chunk trailer, right? This Ike mini flip jig with a chunk trailer on it in black is literally going to imitate crawfish, but it's also going to imitate bluegill, right? And that's the second category that we like. I like jigs that hit both equally well. The chunk, as you can see underwater, is going to have a glide and flap. It's almost a dead action bait, right? It is a great way to emulate a crawfish. Also, a bluegill moving really, really slow. But primarily when I'm throwing the chunk, I am looking for crawfish profile. Now, I don't throw the chunk very much. What I do like is the Yum Craw Pappy, right? I really enjoy the Yum Craw Pappy on that Ike's mini flip jig. I think that that is an awesome combination. It is a very good cold water bait, and better, it is a straight up profile imitation. You can see on the underwater there, it is super duper at imitating that crawfish underwater. Looks really, really, really good. You've got that nice gliding action to it. It's got a great profile. It's not overkill, right? Third in this category is the Berkley Chigger Craw, and I like the Chigger Craw in black and blue. If I'm emulating crawfish early in the year and the water is stained, I'm throwing black and blue almost exclusively if the water is dirty. We're going to talk about clear water here in a minute, but black and blue Berkley Chigger Craw, deadly, deadly, deadly bait, right? Does a great job for me, excuse me, and does a great job for me emulating the baits that I like to throw. And you can see on the underwater right there, it is just a deadly, nice, compact jig. This is my go-to, right, if I'm going to throw a black and blue jig. So that is kind of my crawfish pattern right there. Now, I also like to throw what you would call neutral action baits or almost dead action baits as the water is warming up here pre-spawn. And that starts once again with throwing that bluegill colored jig, and this is all about profile. So we go from crawfish colored and crawfish profile to bluegill profile, but almost a dead action or a neutral action, if you will. And the first bait that I'm going to throw on a neutral action jig is that Berkley Pit Boss. The Pit Boss is an amazing profile, and it's got a decent kick, but it's not overwhelming, right? It's not an overwhelming kick on the jig. What it really is that bluegill shape coming down through the water. Remember, when I'm fishing jigs shallow in the pre-spawn, I'm looking for a reaction bite. I'm flipping it into a piece of cover. I'm dragging it through there. I'm looking for a bass to see it, come react. The pit boss is unmatched, in my opinion, in being the correct profile. Add it to the jig, and you can see on the underwater there, it's just got a killer action. It's got a great profile coming through the water. It looks fantastic, and I've got the utmost confidence in it. So if I see a lot of bluegill shallow on my jig, I'm going to throw that pit boss, right? Right behind it is that Yum, and I forget the name of it off the top of my head, but it is the Yum version cut down, right? I'll link it in the bio, and it is the same thing. It is a profile bait, right? It looks fantastic in the water. I really like white on this bait, and I like white because when you fish this bait on a jig, I'm looking at the tail profile of that creature bait, and it looks like a bluegill. And a lot of times when you fish bluegill up here, you can see they have that white fluorescent tail. This looks amazing when it's flipped into under docks, right? I've got a ton of fish catches fishing a white creature bait on the back of a bluegill colored profile jig because it's just going to do an excellent job for me in creating that profile and creating that nice subtle tail shimmy. You can see on the underwater right there, it looks really, really, really good. So we love to see that white in there if I'm fishing around a lot of bluegill. The final one, if I'm fishing a bluegill profile jig that I'm going to want to throw, is that Missile Baits mini bomb shot. The mini bomb shot on a jig this time of year is a profile killer, right? It just looks great underwater. I prefer this jig when I'm looking for a bigger bite. If I'm looking for a bigger bite with that bluegill profile jig, I'm going to skip this bait up in there. It's just one that I have a lot of confidence in. It gets me a lot of bigger bites around docks when the fish are sunning. And what I'm focusing on there is that profile over action. Action is subtle on all of these baits. I'm not looking to knock their senses out because the water is cold. They're still moving up. They don't need that hammer craw action or whatever it is in that water temperature. So we had crawfish style jigs. We had profile shaped jigs. And remember, I'm basing all of this on bluegill or crawfish, right? What the forage is for that day. Now we go to my favorite bait, and really the only bait that I throw when I need a live action jig. I've caught way too many fish on this jig out deep in a natural lake. A lot of times there is a deep jig bite on the weed lines. Now, for this one, I prefer a bluegill colored jig in totality, right? A green pumpkin with some orange in the belly. Here's a great example right here. This jig right here is what I'm throwing when I'm throwing and trying to get after a bluegill bite out deep. When the bluegill go on beds and the bass move off to the deep weed lines, this jig is going to get picked up and it's never going to leave my hands. 1/2 ounce to 3/8 ounce jig. And I pour my own jigs for this pattern because I love to make my own skirts. As you can see underwater, this skirt pattern is incredible. But the trailer that I go with 100 times out of 100 is the Rage Craw by Strike King. And here's the Rage Chunk, and it is a killer. Those claws are going to hammer and flip underwater. They're going to put off a ton of action. Early spring, you do not want that action. By late spring into post-spawn, that action is a killer, right? In this pattern, when I'm fishing a jig to emulate bluegill, I want a chartreuse trailer. I want some kind of chartreuse in my jig because what I'm looking for, the bluegill, as the water gets warmer, their tails turn chartreuse, right? And as we go through the water column and you can see this jig coming through, it is a killer jig for a bluegill profile. I have not seen a jig underwater that looks better than this one. And for this, I'm targeting 8 to 12 foot weed edges and weed holes, and I'm flipping this in there, letting it hit the bottom, ripping it up, letting it fall back down. The bass are going to eat it on the fall. Sometimes I will take a spike it marker and I will color some blue in there. If the bluegill look a little bit bluer or have bars, I'll put blue bars on the jig skirt. But this right here is my go-to jig when I'm fishing a bluegill profile and the water is warm. Now, a lot of guys have not caught on to the fact that you can fish a do-nothing trailer or a straight tail trailer on a deep spot for fish. And this is where two of my favorite baits come in on two jig profiles that I don't tell people a lot that I throw, and there's a reason why. A lot of times when those fish get pressured, a straight tail bait on a jig is a killer, right? And this is where the rattle worm comes in. The rattle worm on the jig is money, right? I love a big jig profile with a straight tail kicking on the bottom. I love to throw it and shake it on the bottom, right? If those fish have seen a lot of stuff, a lot of times they haven't seen a straight tail jig profile. The rattle worm has an extra rattle in it, so you can hear that on the bottom. It's doing that double duty. And the thing that's a killer about the rattle worm, it's got that subtle action tail. It twitches and bounces along the bottom really well, as you can see on the underwater. This bait is a killer when the water is warm and fish are deep and on deep structure. The other bait that I like to do this with before I got the rattle worm is the Poor Boys Baits Erie Darter in the 3.5 inch version. And as you can see right here, I love this bait because it's got that nice spade tail on it. This bait is a drop shot bait, but it also kills as a jig trailer. And let me tell you, I have got some ferocious bites on this bait at night and also early in the morning when the shad spawn is going on. If you throw this jig up there, you swim it around, you let it fall in those weed beds, it's going to get absolutely slammed, right? I like to fish this bait also on deep structure, right? We're talking 25, 30, 40 feet on a football jig, and I like to fish it sideways. As I roll that jig through there, you can see that tail action that it has, and it just really looks good. The underwater proves it there. It is a fantastic way to get bit. So, now that we've gone through a ton of underwater, I hope you guys have learned something. In terms of jig color, you don't have to really get fancy. If the water's dark, I'm throwing black and blue. If the water's clear, I'm throwing that orange tinted color of jig, right? If the water then warms up past pre-spawn, I'm going almost exclusively to that green pumpkin with orange in it, or that green pumpkin, black chartreuse kind of color in there. If the water is super clear and the fish are up under docks, green pumpkin, straight up green pumpkin jig can be the best. But you got to think about your trailer by what you're trying to emulate. If you're up shallow and the water's in the 50 degrees, I'm emulating crawfish with crawfish style baits. If there's a lot of bluegill present up there when that water is 55 to 60 degrees and those bluegill start coming in, I'm throwing a profile type trailer that's helping me in that aspect. And then as the water gets warmer, I'm throwing a more active trailer like that Rage Chunk, that Rage Craw that is an absolute killer as the water warms up. We hope you guys have learned something with us today. We hope you guys are enjoying the content on the channel right now. Remember, all of our stuff's linked at Omnia. If you go there and purchase product, you're helping the channel out. You're helping sustain what we're doing. If you guys like what we're doing, give us a like, subscribe, and we will see you out there, folks. Thanks for hanging out with us today.